Jaleza. So thank you everybody for joining us today for a discussion on the evolving international security environment and how Pakistan can deal with that. I'll just deliver a few opening remarks and then Dr. Saiba will carry on from there. The word is passing through as it's an understatement that word is passing through or undergoing instability. And as Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said that the world is faced with a perfect storm. And much of this has to do with the rising geopolitical tensions and economic volatility. The major drivers, in my view, are the growing China-US rivalry. Taiwan is the main flashpoint, although confrontation on other fronts is also growing. Then we have this Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it has had repercussions for the entire world. Although international peace and security is threatened, but each one of us is suffering because of the economic impact of that conflict. And then the changes that are taking place in the Middle East, where newer alignments are emerging, and most importantly, the multilateral system is quite fragmented. And if we look around ourselves, Afghanistan it hasn't been stabilized as yet, despite this the change that we saw there. And then India is increasingly becoming belligerent towards Pakistan and probably to other smaller states around it. It is not ready to talk to Pakistan. In short, we have a divided world, a leaderless world, and the most important implication of that is that if it comes to a point or a situation arises where the world has to act unitedly, or I think we don't see a situation where the world can come together to address a situation, whether it is natural calamity or some conflict. So these developments inevitably impact a small or middle state like Pakistan, which then has to leverage its diplomatic strengths and other options that it has available to it. But we need to keep an eye on the resources and the capital that is available to Pakistan. With this brief comment, I'll now request Dr. Mazari Saiba to just give us an overview of how this international security environment is changing and what impact it is going to have Pakistan, especially what sort of pressures Pakistan can face during this situation.
Okay. Thank you, Bakar. I want to begin with a little background because after 9/11, what we saw was the US using 9/11 as an opportunity to reassert its power. It first started by focusing on the Middle East, what I would call West Asia. And if you remember, there was a very famous article, Blood Borders, in which the US, the gentleman who wrote it was a retired intelligence officer, Brad Peters, I think his name was, and he brought a new map which came about how to redraw the Muslim world, and here is a copy of that map. And then they set in motion how to break up the powerful nationalist Muslim states, which had dictators and which were oppressive regimes, no doubt. And then it began with Iraq, and we saw what happened in Libya, we saw Syria, all that broke up. Now, interestingly enough, they did not want to touch on the monarchies. There was an Arab Spring in Bahrain, in which it was crushed very ruthlessly by the rulers. And we found that basically their aim was to target countries like Syria and Libya, which they did quite effectively. But their plans could not totally succeed. They were unable to create an state by breaking up Iraq in the south to counter Iran, supposedly. And even in Iraq, their designs just left chaos. Libya, chaos. Syria, also chaos. So they were not able to coalesce or redraw the borders as they wanted to. They tried in Pakistan, Afghanistan, We saw NATO going in after 9/11. And I would want to make the point that the Security Council had sanctioned ISAF in multilateral force. And then a year or so later, we found that the Secretary General of NATO had written a letter to the Secretary General of the UN that now NATO is going to take charge of ISAF. And if you read all the UN Security Council resolutions, they always refer to ISAF/NATO. So my contention has always been that NATO never had a legitimacy to be in Afghanistan. That is why the UN Security Council kept using the ISAF as the terminology as they kept extending the mandate of this international force. Anyhow, meanwhile, we also found that when Gorbachev was in power, the US had given a commitment to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand at all. But then when the neocons came back in power, they wanted to take advantage of Russia's weakness after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they expanded NATO. And a lot of the ex-Eastern Bloc decided to join NATO as supposedly like a revenge against the Soviet Union and then Russia. And so we found the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., becoming members of NATO. And it's interesting, Putin at one stage had actually said that Russia should also join NATO to create one big European space. But of course, that was rejected. So when Putin got elected again for the second term, he decided that Russia needed to look after its own security interests, given the expansion of NATO. So he started revamping the Russian military and try and build a new strategic system for their nuclear weapons and so on. And then we found that in 2002, the US also abrogated the ABM treaty. And so the agreements for nuclear stability basically ended once the ABM treaty was ended. And Russians then started investing even more heavily in ICBMs and hypersonic and nuclear powered delivery systems. And NATO, Putin kept warning NATO about the expansion of NATO, saying that this would threaten Russian security. But the Americans and NATO did not listen. Then we found, everybody knows in Ukraine, the Americans engineered a regime change and Yanukovych was removed and the present leader was brought in. And we found, in fact, the Russians, seems everybody reveals audio tapes. The Russians revealed an audio tape in which we found the Victoria Nuland, who was the US Assistant Secretary of State. She's discussing how to overthrow the Ukrainian regime. Yanukovych's overthrown, she was supporting it. And Ukraine was going, it was stated Ukraine was going to join NATO under the open door policy that NATO had begun. And then we found this Russians reacting 2008. Russia takes over Crimea to protect its major naval base in the Black Sea. And then it held a referendum to legalize the annexation of Crimea. There was a Minsk Accords that were brokered by Germany and France, but they didn't really, they were reneged by Zelensky when he came to power. And we found EU and US sanctions on Russia. And then we, of course, have the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022. Now, the interesting point is there's a pattern to this. What we are seeing now in the international system is actually the old Cold War policy of encirclement by multilateral defense agreements. So you have expansion of NATO towards the east, trying to encircle Russia, but this time China is also the focus. And therefore you have two very important accords, one of which impacts Pakistan directly. One is the Quad, of course, where India is a partner along with the UK and Japan. And the other, of course, is the one that impacts Pakistan, which is the I2U2, that is India, Israel, UAE, and the US, which is literally on Pakistan's So what the Americans are doing is encircling China through the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific region, and trying to encircle Russia with the expansion of NATO. This is the environment that Pakistan is now presented with. And within that, let's not forget that the old design of redrawing the Middle East is still there. And we saw, for example, Afghanistan, when the Americans realized that they had no option, that their military policy was not working, that they would withdraw eventually, they tried to hold talks with the Taliban in Qatar, the Afghan Taliban, and eventually Trump actually precipitated everything, because Trump had a very different view. He wanted better relations with Russia and with China, interestingly enough. He was even prepared to reach out to the North Koreans. And so Trump hastened the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it was done with such haste eventually that we saw the result, because the Ashraf Ghani regime just collapsed and the Afghan Taliban literally just marched into Kabul, and the rest, as they say, is history. I think at that time the PTI government was in power, and frankly, we stabilized the situation on the border after the American withdrawal. It did not lead to a civil war. It did not lead to a huge movement of refugees into Pakistan. People who wanted to leave Pakistan helped the Europeans and those Afghans who wanted to leave in a very orderly fashion. Now, in principle, our government agreed, but a meeting was called with the locally elected MNAs from that area and from Swat and the surrounding areas, plus the ISI leadership, plus other military officials, and a lot of some of our cabinet members, including myself. And it was decided that in that meeting, because the local elected people had a lot of reservations on this idea of dialogue with the TTP, that it was decided by the then Prime Minister that there would be a committee formed of the local elected leaders and the military, and a consensus should evolve before the dialogue began. That was where we left it, and our government was then removed. So there was no open sanction by the PTI government to the military to hold dialogue as they pleased with the TTP. And because that committee to develop a consensus never met, so we don't know who conducted the dialogue, what happened, but we know what happened in Pakistan, that after the regime change, there was a spate in the terrorism in Pakistan and chaos again in the what was previously the FATA area, now part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So those are things that we have to keep in mind. Now, in this environment where the Americans have adopted a militarist approach towards this region and globally also, reassertion of the American military power, as it were, the Pakistan faces serious challenges. How do we balance between keeping our independence, keeping our strategic assets safe, and keeping our strategic partnership with China, and not undermining that? Because we know the American goal, one of them is to end the CPEC extension, because the Chinese have a longer plan for CPEC. It's not just Pakistan, it's the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes beyond into West Asia. The Chinese have a lot of, they're developing economic corridors in Africa also now. And we have been supportive of that. But after the regime change, there are some issues that have come up. For example, we suspect that I can tell you one thing, for example, when we were formulating our national security policy, the first one that came out, the public document is very interesting, but behind the public document, what happened was that we saw in the document, in the briefing, that there was a mention that Pakistan had a credible minimum deterrence. I pointed out at that time in the meeting that for a number of years now, we have moved away from credible minimum deterrence to full spectrum deterrence. And the final document that came out, which was distributed to the media, so it's not a secret document, it's very interesting. You should read that part on the nuclear deterrence. It says, full spectrum deterrence within the framework of credible minimum deterrence. Now, anybody who knows anything about these two concepts knows that there are contradiction in terms. So we have to be very clear as to what give and take we can do. For example, our cabinet had rejected ALOC, air lines of communication, to the American military to use for drone attacks on Afghanistan. Clearly, categorically, we had said, no, we will not allow that, because we knew that whatever military action the Americans will take on Afghanistan impacts Pakistan eventually, and we become the victims. Now I am told that ALOCs have been granted. The air lines of communication have been granted to the Americans. Now there are a couple of demands the Americans have made consistently from Pakistan regarding strategic issues, especially relating to nuclear deterrence and our nuclear weapons. One, General Saab, you know very well that they have always wanted a freeze on our nuclear weapons development. And now the pressure is to stop developing long-range missiles and to stop development of MIRVs, MIRVs, which we are in the process of doing, and we've acquired some, we made some a lot of progress on it. So that's one of the demands. The freezing, the stopping of the development of long-range missiles, and stopping the development, and obviously not the, and the deployment also would come then, of MIRVs. The other issue that the Americans want from us is that we remove our objections to India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. We have been under pressure, again, it's public knowledge, it's not a secret, that we remove our objections. Because for anyone to become a member of the NSG, there has to be a consensus by the other NSG members, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. China has been withholding that agreement, giving the agreement because of us. In fact, we have not done that much diplomacy on NSG. The Chinese have done more of it. We should have been more active, because our position is that if NSG is to be opened, it should be open to everyone, not just India. And therein lies the problem. So I am very worried that the new compromises that are being made may impact all these demands that the Americans have been making and we have been resisting. And the other important point that, again, we have been under a lot of pressure. The Americans have attacked us openly of our position in the Committee on Disarmament in Geneva, where we have had a very clear-cut position on the FMCT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Our position has been very clearly that we will accept a fissile material treaty after all the countries that hold fissile material reduce their stockpiles. Now, the Americans and the Indians feel no reduction of stockpiles, let's have a cutoff date. Now, we can't afford to accept that, because it will put us permanently at a disadvantage vis-a-vis India in the production of nuclear weapons, because India has a lot of fissile material stockpiles. We don't have that much. And especially after India signed its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, where it agreed to accept safeguarded fissile material from the US, but it allowed India to liberate its own unsafeguarded fissile material to be used for weapons purposes. And there's a long story to that. We had objected to the IAEA board that why are you having a special safeguards agreement with India? They should sign the same one that we signed. And then 3 days later, after our letter went from the now late Shehbaz, our ambassador, Hussain Haqqani pressured directly, and we withdrew that letter and we sent another letter. And by the way, this was also in the open sources, where we said we have no objections to India's special agreement. So we have made many compromises at different times under different governments, unfortunately, with the US on nuclear related issues. So the point is, where do we stand now? Are we going to compromise on the 4, 5 nuclear related issues that I have just named? We've already compromised on ALOCs. The other thing is, what are we going to get if we want to improve our relations with the US? They keep saying they want a strategic partnership, a war on terror. Last time we went on their war on terror, we lost 80,000 Pakistani lives, and we lost our markets. Our exports became very expensive, and there was utter chaos in Pakistan and a resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan. So is that the sort of support we are going to get from the US again vis-a-vis terrorism? Because strategically, they're in partnership with India. They're giving India ABM systems. They're transferring weapons technology to India. And India is a member of I2, U2, as well as the Quad. So where is there space for a supposedly strategic partnership with Pakistan? In my view, we have at best, we can have a transactional relationship. Of course, we can't have a war with the US, but we cannot try to redefine a relationship at a strategic level with the US as long as the US has these strategic military partnerships with India, because there's very little room for Pakistan to have any similar strategic military partnership. We are under pressure on Israel also. I'm afraid that is another issue that has raised its head. We have seen that the Rothschild and co had a meeting with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. The pictures were sent by official sources, so it's not a hidden secret. We saw that Charles Schumacher had come, senator, and 2 days after the Rothschild meeting. And then, according to evidence available and according to Israeli Twitter sources, Schumacher's plane went straight from Islamabad, Noor Khan base, to Israel. So that's another cause of concern for us, that are we putting our eggs back in the US basket when the US strategic environment now is to encircle both Russia and China? So if we are planning to be part of that scheme, then we are going to have a lot of serious issues within Pakistan for our security, our defense. And frankly, I don't think that there's any trade-off vis-a-vis economic bounty that we may get from the US. I don't think that is going to happen. Yes, US is one of our largest trading partners. EU is another one. But China is also a big trading partner of the US, but that doesn't stop the US from having strategic plans to encircle China. So to say that, no, we have a big trade partnership with the US, does not mean that the US will be very nice and kind and treat you with the respect or with a mutual give and take or mutual reciprocity. It will be a one-sided relationship. And the way that the international environment is now going, we can see more and more militarization of state policies. People keep saying that economic issues are the most important, but I think the economic issues have also now become part of the military political agenda of the major powers. That trade has become very much a political military tool that this superpower, the US, is using and its allies are using. So we have to be very wary and be very careful, and we need to draw our long-term perspectives. In my view, we need to continue with our relationship with China. I think this is the time that we should have been building better ties with Russia, regardless of what is happening in the Ukraine. The Ukraine, of course, even though the international community would like peace in Ukraine, the US is using the Ukraine as a proxy to fight its battle with Russia. But at some stage, there has to be a peace dialogue. I don't see Russia putting hands up and waving the white flag. So there will be some sort of compromise and negotiations. So we should, as we had done during the PTI government, maintain a more neutral stance. What do we achieve by selling ammunition and weapons to Ukraine? It serves us no purpose. It antagonizes the Russians, and it gives us no benefits, either economic or political or military. So these are things we have to see. Yes, we need a good relationship with the US, but it'll have to be a transactional one, issue specific. because there is no question, while India is a member of the strategic partnerships, that we can have similar partnerships, strategic partnerships with the United States. So let's not give in to all their demands that they're seeking for temporary breathing space, but for which we will pay a large price in the longer term, as we paid when we joined their war on terror. So these are some of the points that I want to put forward.
Thank you, ma'am. And I should note that Dr. Adil Sultan is also with us. Probably can join the video as well. Dr. Welcome to the discussion. General Lodi, you must have heard Dr. Mazari's points that she made. You may be having your own assessment of the situation. Can you kindly share that assessment with us, and also elaborate if this changing international environment, security environment, brings some opportunities for Pakistan, or will continue to be at the receiving end?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, IPI and Madam Shireen Mazari and Bakir Saab yourself. I think she has so aptly covered the entire canvas that it is little left for us. But of course, I'll give my own perspective also. The opening thing I would say that I think we all agree on that once we talk of environment, the security environment cannot be separated from political and economic environment. So basically, the changes which are taking place in the world are all in the fields of politics and economics and also security, and they're all meshed with each other. So we know very well that superpower, which had enjoyed this total superiority for more than 2 decades, that has created a sort of hubris in their attitude and also carelessness, I would say. They are now trying to prolong their superiority, and any power would like to do that for as long as possible. So that is one thing which is going on. But then the rising power, China, we know, with the help of a smaller partner, comparatively smaller, I would say Russia, they are trying to challenge all this. And once they challenge this political influence, actually, they are also trying to make a dent in the international economic system. And all this, what is going on in the security field, once we talk of Ukraine or what is likely to happen in Taiwan, whatever is happening even in our region, they are all interrelated. So in my understanding, in my assessment, the military planners in America and the strategic thinkers, they have made up their mind that before China militarily surpasses the US, because China has already nearly surpassed them in economy, they are a little behind as far as technology is concerned, and they are quite behind as far as military prowess is concerned. So probably they have decided that before China attains that status, they should be engaged. So in my humble assessment, their first step, the engagement of Russia in Ukraine, is a sequel to their planning ultimately engaging China, which they tried once in Taiwan, they failed, they could not provoke China because Chinese, they have their own plans, and probably you will see very soon they will make more provocative moves as far as Taiwan is concerned, or maybe elsewhere. So the problem with the countries like us is that because the whole thing is in a flux, there is no outcome of Ukraine war as yet. China has not been engaged, although unipolarity has dissipated to quite an extent, but clear-cut bipolarity or multipolarity has not yet emerged. I'm saying clear-cut, where actually the two sides can challenge each other. That balance has not been created. And it will be created sooner or later, but it is not there. So then countries like us have a problem. If we were very clear that which side the things are going to settle down, probably the decision making would have been easier. So as the madam has also brought out, people do they give a lot of the logic that why we should remain with Russia and the West. And I think she talked about exports and expatriates, remittances, education, language, religion. We also at times make this point that religiously we are more affiliated with the West and the American. Then technical equipment, our forces, but I think that is now balanced, because I don't think that now our Air Force entirely depends on the Western equipment, or even our Navy or Army. But yes, we have still something. Then, but we must keep in mind three things, in my opinion. First is that there are deep ties which have developed between US and India, and because of China, we all know that. Need not go into the details. Madam has covered it very well as far as Quad and I2U2 is concerned. Even I take AUKUS as a second line, although India is not a part of that. But I think after retreating from continental area in this region, which was the subcontinent, from once they went back from Afghanistan, then is this Quad Plus, and then is AUKUS. So they have made a number of defense lines around, China and elsewhere. So what do we do in such a tight situation? Of course, there are a lot of leverages with US still, as far as international politics is concerned, technology, then their ability to influence the IFIs. It was with a lot of difficulty that we came out of FATF, and Madam must be knowing it, that they kept on changing the goalpost. They first gave us certain points, and once we achieved all that, then they added 2 more and things like that. So they really made a tamasha out of it. And now whatever is happening with IMF, we should be very clear that it is also because of our relationship with America, which is not yet settled, or and of course then their closeness with India, and so many things. But what are our problems? Our problems are that we cannot give up CPEC. Whatever is happening, the developments in Gwadar, that we say is our future lifeline. Then there are so many other things. So what do we do that without compromising our relations with China? Development of CPEC and Gwadar, our stance on Kashmir, peace in Afghanistan, and I'll come to this, say a few more words, and our nuclear capability, which Madam has already covered, so I'll not go into details. Of course, she's very right when she says that full spectrum deterrence is a step ahead than minimum credible deterrence. So that is a subset of full spectrum deterrence. So I don't know how that sentence was contrived, which has been written in our national security document. So in my opinion, a very hard bargaining would be required, because we are a smaller country. We have nothing to give, as far as I would not say nothing to give. We have little to give, and I'm going to spell out that what is that little that we can give to America in return for whatever we want to get. And we cannot do much harm, but we can do some goods. And the first one is, of course, I said in the last seminar also that if Americans, they want CPEC to remain an economic corridor and does not get converted into a strategic corridor, then they need to talk to us, and we must engage them on this, and we must tell them that it is up to us, that we do not allow anyone to use this corridor as a strategic entity, and militarily strategic entity. Of course, strategies are everywhere. That is one. And secondly, we have a long virgin coastline. If Gwadar is being developed by China, we can ask America and their friends like Australia and Japan to come and talk to us. We may give them some areas on our coastline to develop. For example, Japan can manufacture and their vehicles and export it to Middle East, which is so close to Gwadar, rather than bringing them all the way. So this is the second thing that we have. Then, if America really want to have some interest in Afghanistan, and instead of doing it directly, which they will not be able to do, they can either do something through India, and most of it they can only do through Pakistan, because with Iran they do not have good relations. So, but it has to be mutually beneficial. We cannot have an antagonized Afghanistan, not at all. We want peace in Afghanistan, and of course we also know that Americans would like to dislodge the existing regime in Afghanistan whenever they get a chance. And they have already created a bitterness between Pakistan and Afghanistan because of certain things. As Madam was saying, that maybe they have given the air. I'm not very sure whether they have given the airlines of communication or what. But the Afghan government pointed out this thing, that maybe the drone attack which was carried out to eliminate one of the Al Qaeda leaders, it flew over Pakistani territory, which is very sad. I mean, yes, I know very well that Imran Khan's government had refused as far as that corridor is concerned. So we can help them to have better relations with Afghanistan, but we can never help them to work on dislodging the existing regime and having we pitting ourselves against that regime. That would be very dangerous. And some of our friends, they say it very casually, and we should be very careful once we talk such things. Okay, we know that Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is an enemy, and we have to fight them, and we have to finish them. Actually, we had nearly finished them. And if you look at the timelines, once they became more active, it coincides with the regime change. It was after the regime change that they became very active. So why did that happen? Because somebody allowed more influence, American influence in the region. That is my reading. I can be wrong. So these things, these dots need to be connected. So I would say that it is difficult for us to make this balancing act, because probably Americans are telling us once again that are you with us or against us? And we being meek in our hearts and minds, more than an economy that we keep on saying, probably we are succumbing to that. And this is a very dangerous thing. For a very short period gains, we are compromising on long time gains. We cannot afford to have not good relations with China, with Afghanistan, with Iran, with Central Asian countries, with Russia, because they are our natural future allies, not only because of geography, but also because of the political changes that are taking place. Even you must have noticed that in the Middle East, those countries like Saudi Arabia, they are also talking, they're trying to culture good relations with Russia and China. So everybody knows that which way the wind is flowing. I do not know that why we are trying to swim across the current or against the current. So I will stop here. It is a difficult time. We have to while away some time because this balancing act is becoming difficult. But as the Ukraine war goes closer to its end, and as we see whether China really gets entangled with America and Taiwan, we will be able to make up our minds much better. But a visionary strategist should take these decisions today. We can see the rising East, which is in our vicinity, geographically closer to us. Economically, they are doing better, and we can see our own interests. So the baseline is that we must see that to which side our interests align more. And if we have to take a decision, we should take decision accordingly. Thank you very much. आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही बाकर. No, I can't hear you.
जी सर, मैं भी आवाज नहीं आ रही सर. हाँ, अभी थोड़ी सी आवाज आई थी माइक में. प्रॉब्लम. Yeah.
नहीं वो there is something wrong with the connection of this mic. आप दोबारा देखें. You may change the mic. नहीं.
No.
आप बोले.
वो थोड़ी आ रही है. सिग्नल्स में यूज करो. नॉर्मली एविएटर्स ये यूज करते हैं कि आई कांट हियर यू.
बाकी
अब आपको आ रही है
जी अभी ठीक.
जी लग रहा है अभी आप कोशिश कर रहे हैं. दूर से आवाज आ रही है.
माइक रखते हैं आप ऐसे बोल.
अच्छा जी, अब आ रही है आवाज आपको.
जी.
अच्छा जी, डॉक्टर साहब although we would like to hear your understanding of this international security situation in general, but more specifically, Dr. Saaba spoke about the challenges to the nuclear program, and these questions are not new. We have been hearing about them for a very long time, and you had the first-hand experience of, having seen those challenges at work. So, do you know, or do you have some information, or do you believe that these pressures may have renewed now when we are faced with these economic challenges, and we are again trying to turn back to our old ally?
Thank you, Bakir Saab, and it's a pleasure in the company of senior co-panelists. And sorry for late joining, because we had a third session of convocation today, which just ended at 5:35 or so. So it was 2 days long, multiple sessions. So we just cleared the backlog of COVID, and we graduated number of students. Acha, about nuclear issues, as you said, the first-hand experience, I am as knowledgeable or ignorant as my senior co-panelists are about nuclear issues, because I don't represent and no longer work in the SPD. Lekin the way we analyze, and or specifically I have analyzed in my writings also about these issues, I think I'll not get into this politics, or because everything in Pakistan today is too sensitive, and people don't want to actually talk about nuclear issues lest you are being labeled as something creating sensational news about nuclear issues. But I'll just briefly explain, and that's my understanding of some of the issues that Dr. Saab also mentioned. And I'm not contesting, but I'm just giving my understanding of this mention of full spectrum deterrence in the nuclear security strategy of Pakistan. I think this phrase was just picked up verbatim from the NCA statement, and the NCA statement says, and repeated NCA past 2 or 3 statements, they do state that Pakistan will maintain full spectrum deterrence within the ambit of credible minimum deterrence. If you see it from literally meaning, yes, it appears conflicting phrases, that on one hand you are talking about credible minimum deterrence, but on the other hand you are talking about full spectrum deterrence. But we have to see the genesis of this concept, how it evolved, and how it was projected at that time in 2011, once we tested short-range ballistic missiles in Nasr, or the tactical nuclear weapons. And I don't want to go back into the history of Cold Start, because that's would be diverging from your main topic of changing international security environment and Pakistan's options. But it is important, because I've heard this in a number of seminars or conferences. People do talk about race question, and that's fair, because as I said, in literal words of meaning, if you see, it appears to be conflicting. But once the Cold Start doctrine was introduced by India, at that time, Pakistan introduced the short-range ballistic missiles to give a message that there is no space for any limited war against Pakistan. So at that time, the spectrum meant the spectrum of threats, from limited war to an all-out war. So we have the capabilities to deal with the spectrum of threats. So that is why General Kidwai and several others, they continue to state, and this is how they define, that these capabilities that we are developing are good enough to deal with all kinds of threats, ranging from a limited conflict, IBG kind of an operation, a Cold Start kind of operation, to an all-out war. So that was the intent. And I see the same way, because if you say that we have moved to full spectrum deterrence capability, that means you are going to ICBMs also, you are going to, you have developed Triad also, and you are also going to low-yield subkiloton kind of artillery shells also. I don't think so we can afford that, or neither there is an intent to build that spectrum of capabilities. We do not have that many resources to build the entire spectrum of the capabilities. So we need to understand, this was intended, the message was that the spectrum of threats that we are facing, so we have made adequate capability. And now why it was important to maintain that within the ambit of credible minimum deterrence, because CMD, or credible minimum deterrence, itself is a dynamic concept. It was never a static construct that these many numbers would be good enough. The minimum is flexible because the capabilities that the other side is building, so your minimum would also be relevant to that side. So full spectrum deterrence to counter the full spectrum of threats while remaining, because this is the policy option, the policy credible minimum deterrence. We cannot afford to, and we do not have the resources to move away from minimum posture. So I don't see this was intended to please anybody. This was taking into consideration our own limitations, that we cannot engage in an arms race with India or with anyone else. The second point about the NSG, yes, NSG is a serious issue and had been a serious issue. I'll just very politely and respectfully disagree with Dr. Sahiba, which is always difficult to disagree with her. But I think NSG diplomacy was a success from Pakistan because we are not part of the NSG. NSG makes decisions on consensus. So if we were not part of the NSG, we could not obstruct India. So what we did was we helped our friends and some of the European countries also who were reluctant to give India permanent membership because they were always skeptical about this exemption granted to India in 2008 from the NSG guidelines. And they were not very happy, but they were arm twisted and they were forced to agree to that in 2008. And rightly, Dr. Sahiba mentioned about that letter, that infamous letter, and very unfortunate that we backed off at that time. Our political government, they backed off under pressure. But in subsequently, once the NSG member issue was there, I think we took a very firm stance, and many of other friends also, and some of the European countries, they supported this principle, and that is how we were able to stall India's membership. I see it as a success by a country which has very limited resources, influence in the international nuclear politics, but still we managed to that. Now coming to some of the issues that I would want to just highlight very briefly. I have identified 5 or 6 issues, I think, taking into recognizing your topic that you wanted me to speak briefly about changing international security environment. First is that Cold War mentality is back. The politics of blocks, I think that is back. So I'll expand on this. Second is how Russia and China are going to deal with this challenge of post-Ukrainian conflict, if and when it happens. Third is what is going to happen to US Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific strategy, because till last year, it was all about Indo-Pacific or strategy, and all the alliances were built to support that. Fourth is the future of JCPOA. So if Russia is pushed and there are lessons for other countries, probably there could be some incentive for countries like Iran to use their nuclear issue for bargaining for more political concessions, or even to break off if they want to in the future. The final is the suspension of New START treaty. That is very significant because this treaty, the suspension of this treaty, for now, it has not been abrogated by President Putin, but it sends a signal that it is quite difficult for any new arms control arrangement to be negotiated between the major powers, the United States, Russia, and China. So if there would be less incentive amongst the major powers, this would be reflected at the regional level, especially in South Asia, where India has always been trying to find justification to build more weapons by citing China as a major threat. So it would be less inclined to deal with the arms control arrangement with Pakistan. So these are 4 or 5 issues. Now coming briefly, I'll just be brief about this Cold War mentality. When we say NATO is in a difficult position. There are United States and some of its allies are pushing for its expansion, but many of the European countries, they are feeling the heat after the Ukrainian invasion of Russia, because they are going to be affected. Whatever happens to Ukraine, Ukraine has already been destroyed, and the other European countries, they are under economic and political stress. We don't hear news from the Russian side, we only hear the Western perspective where they see this global coalition against Russia. I think there is a strong resentment amongst the public in the European capitals also. I've seen some of the Twitter trends also. There's a backlash from the public, and they do not want this conflict to go indefinitely or to be prolonged because the economic repercussions or the political repercussions are being felt by these European countries. And we have already seen how difficult these past winters was for some of the countries, especially countries like Germany. And now this issue of alliances, if this bloc politics, which was already resurging in a way, our neighbor, it is very eager to build its military potential or political influence by joining US-led alliances. We can possibly see some more alliances in the future, which may be, earlier it was all about mainly China, but for future, probably the justification would be that it is Russia-China alliance, and hence we need to be together, and there could be more military alliances to deal with this threat perception that might become a center piece of US future national security strategy or defense agreements. In the same domain, the Indo-US growing partnership, we saw these 4 foundational agreements, then we saw also space situational agreement that US and India, they signed. Essentially, India projects that these are to counter Chinese threat, but whatever the capabilities India acquired because of these agreements, the enhanced situational agreement, space situational agreement, this would definitely enhance India's military potential. India and China are never going to fight a war. We have seen in the LAC also, and we saw in the LOC also, how India reacts to 2 different adversaries. But whatever the capabilities India is able to develop, these would be available to be used against Pakistan. And that's a concern that because of these international politics where US has different interests, India is exploiting that to its own advantage to build its military and political muscle. The second about that I talked about, the Russia and China's, the perception that China, probably Russia and China are going to forge some kind of a informal alliance because the interest converge. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, hypothetically, China knows then the guns would be turned towards China. So they would be very much interested to see how Russia resists this and what is the outcome of this conflict. The outcome of the Asia-Pacific strategy, the third, because whatever we saw till last year, as I mentioned earlier, this was all about US pivoting to Asia-Pacific, where it was forging alliance, different military alliances and the political alliances. After this Ukrainian conflict, and this is likely to be prolonged, it would be interesting to see how it is again reconfigured to justify what the United States is doing. The fourth one was the future of JCPOA, as I briefly mentioned. This conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, gives some incentive to Iran also and Russia also to use this for the political gains, and that is going to be a slippery slope because recently we saw some of the announcements that they are increasing their uranium enrichment levels, which is moving closer to acquiring a bomb potential. For whatever reasons Iran wants to do that, engage in that kind of brinkmanship, it would definitely bring focus on this region, and this would be disturbing trends because we live in this region. Finally, the suspension of New START, I've already said about this thing or mentioned about these, that there is going to be lesser incentive for other countries to engage or negotiate new arms control arrangements if the major powers are disinclined to honor their earlier commitment, or they're least interested to discuss arms control arrangement at the global level. So the middle powers, especially countries like India, they would use this opportunity because they were earlier already reluctant to not to engage with Pakistan by citing China as the principal threat. And they had been building this narrative that any future arms control has to be trilateral, where China must also be included. And this narrative of strategic chain, that unless United States does something, only then China will react or do something. And if China doesn't do, India will not do anything. So that was already a justification used by many Indian scholars to discourage any new arms control arrangement. Now, after this new start, I think India would find incentive not to engage constructively with its regional countries, including Pakistan or China. And this is where this is going to be troubling for us also, because whatever India builds, it does bring some pressure on Pakistan to counter that. So I'll just stop over here and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sab. Sorry, I just want to intervene. I'm sorry, I have to leave. So I just want to make 3 quick points. One is when I said about economic issues now becoming part of the political military strategy and militarized in a way. I forgot to give the example of the Americans sabotaging the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines, which has become a big issue in international law also, because this is a direct a contravention of international law that you go and you destroy these international pipelines. The 2 other issues that I wanted to take up. One is to stabilize a nuclear deterrence. At the end of the day, you will need second strike capability. To have second strike capability, you would need a triad, because without SLBMs, you cannot have second strike capability. So I think the triad option is something that we have gone for and we will have. And therefore, the fact of the matter is that if you have committed to full spectrum deterrence, it's not that you'll develop so many nuclear weapons, but that you will meet each threat at the level and be able to deal with that threat. Meeting the threat at all levels and holding your own, that is basically full spectrum deterrence. And I still maintain that it's a contradiction in terms to have minimum credible deterrence and full spectrum deterrence. We have to decide once and for all, either we have full spectrum deterrence or we go back to the 70s with the ridiculous credible minimum deterrence when India is talking about cold start, when they're talking of preemptive war and developing. I'm not saying that full spectrum deterrence means you develop ICBMs, because we don't have a threat where we need ICBMs. But certainly we need to be able to meet the threat at all levels and hold our own at every level. Because if you remember, after the Kargil war, the Indian commission that was formed, they said we succeeded in meeting the threat at our level, and we sustained and we held our own at that level. I think post Balakot, we showed them the same, that we could meet the threat at any level of our choosing, our time and place, and be able to sustain that and be able to win that. So I think meeting the threat at all levels is important, hence full spectrum deterrence. And also you need a triad, because you need submarine launched missiles, otherwise you cannot have second strike capability. So I don't think we can give up the triad option. And I'm really sorry I have to leave, because I didn't realize we have an emergency meeting of our party due to developments that have happened.
Thank you very much. So we're coming to Dr. Jaspal. Thank you, Dr. Sab, for joining us. You're quite committed at the university, much like Dr. Adil Sultan Sahib. So we'll be shifting away from strategic discussion for a while, and now going back to the political side of this discussion.
Bakar, if you allow me, just I would like to get your permission to leave, because my next.
I know, sir, you had told me before even.
6:30. So डॉक्टर जसपाल साहब से स्पेशल इजाजत लेकर मैं जाऊंगा, मेरे उस्ताद मोहतरम है आदिल्स जो कुछ उन्होंने कहा. थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर एवरीथिंग एंड विल मीट अगेन इंशाल्लाह. थैंक यू.
Okay, Dr. Jaspal. How can Pakistan's foreign policy adapt itself to this changing international environment? So if we look at this problem from a political perspective.
I think that thank you very much for inviting me and bearing me and accepting my late entry. And with this permission, of course, Dr. Adil already had spoken, and maybe I missed the Dr. Sherry Mazari's presentation, but her intervention was very appropriate on the full spectrum deterrence. Having said this, I can frame like this, that how I'm looking the evolving or emerging strategic environment. And within this international strategic environment, or what we can use a global geopolitics, what are the trends? And then how Pakistan is adjusting, whether we are on a right direction of the time or opting the right choices or not. So quickly, I think that the three important things explain us the trends. One is the current situation is dominated by Pax Americana versus Pax Senecia. What we read in 1993, Clash of Civilization, that kind of a thing in a different way we are seeing in Chinese and American, you can say, strategic competition. Second important thing is the cult of offensive seems to dominate the foreign and strategic policies of the great powers, or including the regional power like India. And how I can substantiate, due to this cult of offensive in the great powers' foreign and strategic policy, today we have 4 nuclear flashpoints. One is, which is normally everyone is saying, that Kashmir is a nuclear flashpoint. Now Ukraine is a nuclear flashpoint, which is Europe is entirely a nuclear flashpoint. And here I can give a reference to the 30th September, Mr. Putin's speech, when he said that there is a precedent of a use of nuclear weapon when the Americans used against non-nuclear weapon state, and now Russia is opting a military operation, having a military operation against a non-nuclear state. So the third important nuclear flashpoint, which is this Taiwan Strait. We have seen the way the things were boiling up during the October, Taiwan, and then the fourth one is, of course, Korean Peninsula. So this is a strategic environment in which we are seeing. So we find that the states and societies are moving towards an aggressive foreign policies, and as evident in their, you can say, makeup of military muscles. This is giving a rise to what we call it alliances politics, or I can say the alliances politics rejuvenated. Let me give, NATO was there to continue. It means that alliances politics has never been final, so it continued. But anyway, NATO, 30 countries plus 2 more applicants. So that means what the Biden used in May 2022 term, NATOization, that gives you the idea that alliances politics is there. Then Quad and I2, U2, AUKUS, these gives you the clear messages that the alliances politics have started. And unfortunately, these 3 visible alliances, Pakistan's space is not there. Now, the third important way is looking is that what is in our neighborhood. I think that when we look about in the neighborhood, Pakistan may have some space to negotiate with the Americans for the Afghanistan, but Americans have their own CIA army in Afghanistan. They have a different agenda in Afghanistan, and if within the Afghanistan, the great powers competition, which again drifted us towards the Eastern powers or the China and Russia. Similarly, within the South Asian context or Indo-Pacific or in Asia-Pacific context, I think Americans have now established, and it is very clear that India is their lead to balance the China's rise. And that is the way the Chinese and Indians are trying to manage their relationship, not permitting the line of actual control conflict to escalate. Whatever the reason could be, but it has not been escalating, but still conflict is there. With Iran, Pakistan is now trying to improve its relation, and that is a convergence and variables are there. despite the strategic competition of the Gulf states or in the Persian Gulf. But what is the convergence is the 400 billion China and the Iran strategic partnership, and we are also part of CPEC and BRI in that context. Similarly, Americans are having pressurizing the China, you can say Iran, and at the same time, this Iran and Russia and China triangle also give a space for having a better relations with it. So this is a situation in which we are looking Pakistan that the strategic environment is a complex, whether our policymakers are or we are having a sort of thing. Of course, our political polarization and political instability within the state and economic, which is resulting into an economic instability, it limits Pakistan's choices. But Pakistan has always had a limited choices, and we have to this way we try to figure out. My understanding is that Pakistan officially Pakistan's official declaratory policy is that balancing among the great power. But our balancing, I think, strategy seems in a quagmire because of the fast, you can say, evolving situation at the international level, and we are lagging behind because when you have a within the state different kind of the consensus, no consensual policy, and terrorism and economic means are knocking you naturally, your dimension is not clear. Second important thing is that no one is opposing in Pakistan to have a good relations with United States, but unfortunately, whenever there's something, there is some kind of the rumors that Pakistan is giving a basis, something Pakistan is doing this. Of course, officially it has been denied, but your Chinese or Russian, where your economic and future strategic collaboration is lying, it is always, people start looking at it with suspicions. Finally, in this context, in this evolving situation, our enemy is in a better position, but at the same time, still we have options, but unfortunately, we are not clear how to pursue our options. When I say not clear how to pursue, that we are playing, looking the great powers in a triangular manner, knowing this, but at the same time, making our choices to sit in every corner of this triangle, but on a strategic chessboard, such a policy is not workable. Yes, on the economic chessboard, such policies are workable, but we have to manage it, that whether at this moment, what are our vulnerabilities? And I agree, economic vulnerabilities are there. Then you have a CPEC and the other kind of the things. But your strategic vulnerability is there, that when the strategic vulnerability is emanating from the eastern side, with which states it has a military alliance or a strategic partnership heading towards a military alliance. So we need a more clarity within this, of course, as earlier, the Honorable Dr. Sher Mazari very rightly pointed out that for a full spectrum, you need to go for a triad, yes, for indigenous, for your self-defense, or if you are adopting look within self-help strategy, definitely you need a full spectrum in letter and spirit instead of just hammering this kind of a thing that whether, I think this minimum deterrence or a limited deterrence, these terms now lost their significance. We can simply stick with full spectrum deterrence. I think it qualifies. Yes, we adopt a minimum approach without, we avoid an arms race with India, but it doesn't mean that full spectrum deterrence means that we are ending up in an arms race. So with this clarity, if we can move at the domestic level for strengthening our defense and at the same time at foreign and strategic chessboard globally, then we will have a better future. Otherwise, we will remain victim of complexities and vulnerabilities, and these ambiguities will be causing, I think, will be going to tax Pakistan. So with this, thank you very much, Bakr.
Yes, Dr. Saab, I'd like to get back to a point that you raised in your remarks. You said that Pakistan needs to develop a balanced approach towards its relations with great powers. So this is something that everybody recommends. But looking at Pakistan's track record, do you think Pakistan is good at maintaining this balance, or this is just a mirage? The balancing thing is a mirage in diplomacy, which cannot be achieved in practice.
I think that Pakistan has to adopt a bilateralism, strict bilateralist approach in the relations with the great powers. And in that, where we have a identical menu and choices are available, we can work and we try to distance. But of course, on a strategic chessboard, when you say balanced approach, it isn't workable because Pakistan's strategic environment or Pakistan's geographical location makes it a strategic actor, whether we like it or not. Though the previous government said that we will be going to focus on the geoeconomics. Yes, it's an important sort of thing, but Pakistan is not getting a space to ignore the geostrategic domain of the policies. So in this context, of course, we have to look and see how the trends are evolving. Within these trends, by balancing approach doesn't mean that we can start thinking, because we have to not go with this mentality of rented state as we used to be, but you have to bring a clarity in that on a strategic chessboard on which side you are. If you are not, then you are missing the train. That is my point.
Thank you, Dr. I think we'll conclude this today. We had a wonderful discussion. Some eminent panelists were here, and discussion, went for quite some time, I think. And probably, Dr. We may have some follow-up questions, which we'll subsequently email to you and other participants, when our colleagues will prepare the report of this session. And we'll also share that report with you. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much. Please accept my apology again for being late.
No problem, sir. Thank you.